My name is Frances Mallory. I am 42 years old, a former chef who once believed that home and family were worth every sacrifice. I left a rising career in a respected restaurant because I thought love and stability were worth more than any Michelin star. Now I am standing in a crowded courtroom at my divorce hearing, facing a husband who once held my hand in a tiny apartment kitchen and promised partnership. Today, he's fighting for full custody, claiming I am unstable and unfit. The weight of that accusation presses harder than any knife I ever held in a kitchen. The room feels colder than winter steel. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead, humming softly like a restless insect. The air smells of paper, cologne, and tension. I am gripping an old wooden spoon in my right hand, the one my mother gave me when I first moved out on my own. I carried it here without thinking, tucked inside my bag, a small anchor to the pieces of my life that still feel real. My fingers wrap around its worn handle as if it could hold me upright. Grant sits across the aisle, posture relaxed and smug. His expensive suit fits him perfectly. His success in real estate has given him confidence that borders on arrogance. His attorney leans in and whispers something that makes him smirk. He glances at me with an expression that says I am nothing more than a burden he has finally decided to discard. To him, I am outdated furniture, once useful, now inconvenient. My 8-year-old daughter, Lena, sits beside his lawyer. Her legs dangle above the floor, swinging nervously. She clutches her small tablet to her chest, pressing it so tightly that her knuckles turn pale. I want to reach for her, but I remain still. If I move, if I cry, if I react in any way, they will twist it against me. I have learned that silence can be both a shield and a prison. The judge clears his throat and begins reviewing the final arguments. My attorney shifts beside me, preparing for the inevitable ruling. I inhale deeply, preparing myself for the moment I lose everything. I have prepared for heartbreak, humiliation, and the possibility that Lena will be taken from me. My chest feels hollow, as if someone scooped out the very center of my being, leaving only cold space. Then something impossible happens. Lena stands. Her chair scrapes loudly against the floor, cutting through every whispered conversation. She raises her hand with a steadiness I have never seen in her, and her voice, though small, carries through the courtroom. "Your Honor, may I show you something that Mom does not know about?" Every head turns. The judge blinks, surprised, then nods. "Go ahead, sweetheart." Grant shifts in his seat, suddenly uneasy in his. Attorney freezes, eyes narrowing, as if trying to anticipate what is coming. I stare at my daughter, utterly confused. I did not ask her to do anything. I did not even know she brought the tablet. Lena steps forward, hands trembling slightly, and connects the tablet to the courtroom monitor. The screen flickers to life, bright and intrusive in the dim courtroom. My breath catches in my throat. I squeeze the wooden spoon, feeling its familiar grooves dig into my palm. My heart beats faster, pounding against my ribs. A voice plays through the speakers, a laugh, a very familiar laugh, Grant's laugh. It echoes through the courtroom, confident and cruel, followed by a soft female voice. The room goes silent, as if the very air has been vacuumed out. The judge leans forward. The bailiff stiffens. I feel the blood drain from my face. No one moves. No one speaks. The truth is about to break open, and I have no idea what Lena has uncovered. Before we go any further, if you believe in stories of quiet courage and second chances, I would love for you to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps more people find these gentle yet powerful stories of women rediscovering their strength. The video continues playing. The screen glows bright. The courtroom holds its breath. In that moment, everything begins to change. 1 year before that moment in the courtroom, my life looked very different. I used to wake before dawn, my alarm set for 5, the house still wrapped in darkness while the world outside slept. I would step quietly into the kitchen, tie my apron, and reach for the old wooden spoon that my mother placed in my hand the day I left her home to build a family of my own. The spoon was smooth from years of stirring sauces and soups, and I believed it carried warmth, history, and the quiet blessing of generations of women who fed their families with love rather than praise. Before I married, I had been a rising chef with a reputation for refined comfort food, and there were whispers that my menu could earn a star. I left the restaurant because Grant and I agreed that family came first, and he held my hands then and told me that my talent made him feel lucky. In those early years, when money was tight and his clothes smelled faintly of sawdust from renovation jobs, he would kiss my forehead and thank me for every packed lunch, every late-night meal, every dish that reminded him of something tender. We promised we would grow together. We promised we would never become strangers. Each morning I chopped vegetables, simmered broths, and packed a lunchbox for Grant to take to his office. Real estate was beginning to pick up for him, and he said homemade food helped him feel grounded. I placed the fork, napkin, and sandwich just so, the way he liked, and I tucked a small handwritten note inside the lid even when I was tired. Lena would wander sleepily into the kitchen and sit at the table while I worked, swinging, her feet and humming. I would whisk eggs with the wooden spoon and think about the restaurant kitchen I left behind, the clang of pans, the orders called out, the applause of satisfied diners. I told myself I did not miss it. I told myself that feeding the people I loved mattered more. When Grant returned home in the evenings, I would greet him with a warm plate and ask about his day. At first, he kissed my cheek and said he could not do any of it without me. Then gradually, the words stopped. The gratitude faded like steam rising from a pot. As his commissions grew and his confidence expanded, I noticed subtle changes. He began wearing tailored suits and polished shoes, and he styled his hair in ways he never bothered with before. He stayed out later, saying he needed to socialize for business, and he shrugged when I asked if he would be home for dinner. I continued waking early, preparing meals, and tending to every detail of our home. He stopped opening the notes I tucked into the lunchbox. He started leaving the empty containers in his car rather than bringing them inside. One evening, after I spent hours preparing roasted chicken, fresh bread, and a delicate sauce, he sat down, took a bite, and said nothing. I waited for a smile, a nod, a simple acknowledgement. Instead, he reached for his phone and scrolled through emails while chewing. When I finally asked if everything was all right, he looked up and said the sentence that would echo through my bones. He said I was only at home and asked what could possibly make me tired. That sentence settled over the kitchen like a cold draft. I stood still, the wooden spoon in my hand, my knuckles white from the grip. I did not argue. I swallowed the sting and cleared the dishes while he stepped into his office to take a call. Lena watched me, her eyes wide and questioning, and she reached for the spoon, touching the handle as if she sensed it held something important. I smiled for her sake, but inside I wondered when the foundation of our life shifted. I wondered when my worth became invisible. I wondered why the man who once thanked me for every kindness now spoke as though all I did was nothing. I kept waking at 5. I kept cooking. I kept hoping he would remember who we were before success sharpened him into someone unrecognizable. Yet each day the silence grew heavier. When he left the house, he no longer kissed my cheek. He simply grabbed his keys and walked out the door. I stood in the kitchen and thought that I had once been the foundation of our home, but now I felt like an outdated object tucked on a forgotten shelf. The wooden spoon was the only thing that still felt real, and each time I held it, I remembered the warmth of my mother's hands and the promise that a home built with love would never crumble. But I also realized that love alone could not hold together walls that someone else was pushing apart. I began to feel a quiet ache that settled beneath my ribs, and I wondered how long I could keep pretending that everything was fine when the man I once trusted no longer saw me. The morning light would spill across the counter, and I would grip the wooden spoon and remind myself that I mattered, even if no one said so, into the quiet of my breathing still. The morning the courier arrived, I was in the kitchen with the wooden spoon in my hand, stirring batter for Lena's breakfast waffles. The sun filtered through the curtains in a soft golden stripe across the counter, and for a moment, life felt ordinary. I heard the knock at the door and wiped my hands on my apron before answering. A man in a navy jacket stood on the porch holding a thick envelope and asked me to sign for it. I assumed it was something for Grant's growing business, another contract or property file. So I thanked him and carried it inside without thinking. My name was written across the front in heavy black ink, and the return address belonged to a law office downtown. A strange chill slid down my spine as I broke the seal and pulled the documents free. The first page hit me like a blast of freezing air. It was a petition for divorce filed by Grant, claiming that I was unstable and unfit, insisting that I made no financial contribution to our household, demanding full custody of Lena, and asking for all joint assets to be transferred to him. My heart thudded in my chest. My hands trembled. The wooden spoon slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the tile floor with a sharp sound that startled me. I bent down to pick it up, but for a moment my hand hovered in the air as though my body forgot how to move. The batter on the counter began to settle, and the sweet smell of vanilla felt like an insult to the shock flooding through me. I walked into the living room and sat down slowly, unable to feel my legs beneath me. The words on the page blurred as though my eyes refused to accept them. I read the accusations again, each one colder than the last. Unstable, unproductive, unnecessary. My breath came in shallow pulls. I did not cry or scream. Instead, a hollow stillness spread through me, metallic and sharp. The refrigerator hummed in the background, and the house felt unbearably quiet. I reached for my phone with shaking hands and opened the bank app, hoping there was some mistake. The balance showed 0 where our joint savings used to be. Every account we shared had been drained. The room tilted slightly as though the floor had shifted beneath me. My pulse pounded in my ears. When Grant came home that evening, he walked in with the confidence of someone who already believed he had won. He removed his coat, set his keys on the counter, and looked around the kitchen without acknowledging me. I stood near the stove, the wooden spoon now resting beside the skillet like a witness. I asked him why the accounts were empty and why a courier had delivered divorce papers to our door. He did not look surprised. He poured himself a glass of sparkling water and leaned against the counter with a casual air that made my stomach twist. He said that he had been planning this for months and that he finally had enough evidence to prove I was emotionally unfit. I stared at him, unable to process how the man who once thanked me for every meal was now speaking to me like a stranger delivering a verdict. I reminded him of the years I supported him when he had nothing and the sacrifices I made for our family. He shrugged and said that in America, the person who earns the money has the rights, and that staying home to cook was not considered a contribution. His tone was detached, almost instructional, as if he were explaining a business transaction rather than dismantling our marriage. The sentence hung in the air, sharp and cruel. I felt something inside me tighten, but I did not raise my voice. I did not throw anything or collapse into tears. I simply stood there, feeling the cold emptiness spread through my chest like frost creeping across glass. He said he would be filing for full custody because Lena needed stability, and that he had already arranged a temporary order. I steadied myself by placing one hand on the counter and inhaling slowly. Lena walked into the kitchen then, rubbing her eyes and asking if dinner was ready. Grant immediately softened his voice and scooped her into his arms, telling her that everything was fine. I watched them, my body still and quiet, my mind unable to form words. The wooden spoon lay on the counter, the handle worn from years of use, a symbol of every meal, every act of care, every quiet moment of love I poured into this family. I picked it up and held it tightly, feeling its familiar curve against my palm, yet for the first time it felt heavy rather than comforting. After putting Lena to bed, I sat alone at the table with the divorce documents spread before me. The house was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. I traced the grain of the spoon with my thumb and wondered at what point I stopped being the foundation of this home and became something disposable. The metallic emptiness pressed deeper, and I sat there until the sky outside faded into night, unable to move, unable to speak, feeling like the floor beneath my life had finally given way. After the night I sat staring at the divorce papers, the next day unfolded with a strange clarity that felt almost unreal. Grant began tightening control over every aspect of our household finances, and I watched the shift with a numb steadiness that surprised even me. He introduced a new family budgeting app and insisted that all purchases be logged and approved. I opened the refrigerator one morning and found a note taped inside listing acceptable grocery items and weekly limits. When I tried to buy fresh produce for Lena's lunches, the card declined at the register and a notification popped up on my phone saying the transaction required Grant's authorization. The cashier offered a sympathetic smile while I fumbled for a few loose bills tucked in my coat pocket. My cheeks burned with embarrassment, and I carried the small bag home, feeling like the walls of the house were closing in. Later that afternoon, I checked the banking app and saw that the secondary card connected to our joint account had been deactivated. Grant claimed it was for security. He said that since I stayed home, I did not need a card of my own and that he would transfer funds when necessary. His tone was flat, clinical, as if he were adjusting office protocols rather than stripping me of independence. I felt my pulse rise but stayed calm. I had learned that any sign of upset would be used to support the narrative that I was unstable. I continued cooking meals for him, though he barely touched them. I packed Lena's snacks and helped her with homework, but I could feel her watching us, sensing the tension though she could not name it. One evening, Grant announced that he had stopped sending money to his mother for her medication and said that I was responsible because I managed the household spending. His mother called crying, accusing me of selfishness, and Grant stood in the doorway listening, arms crossed, without defending me. I tried to explain that I had no access to the accounts anymore, yet she hung up before I finished. The cold emptiness in my chest deepened. I walked outside to breathe and found our neighbor, Evelyn Blake, tending to the potted herbs on her porch. She was 65. A retired teacher and a widow with kind eyes and a posture that spoke of quiet resilience. She looked up and asked if I was all right. Something in her voice dissolved the barrier I had been holding. I told her that things in my home were changing faster than I could process, and she nodded with an understanding that did not require details. She invited me to sit on the porch bench, and the fading afternoon light settled gently around us. She said that women like us were remembered only when needed, and her words settled into me like a truth I had been avoiding. I felt the wooden spoon still in my hand. I had brought it outside without noticing, gripping it like a lifeline. Evelyn glanced at it and smiled softly, saying that every woman carries an object that holds the story of her sacrifices. I looked at the worn handle and felt a sting behind my eyes. I returned home and found Grant reviewing the budgeting app, criticizing the cost of basic household items. He said that efficiency mattered and that emotional spending was irresponsible. I asked if buying fruit for our daughter counted as emotional spending, and he replied that I was overreacting and proving his point about instability. I felt the metallic emptiness again, spreading like cold water through my veins, but I maintained composure. Lena peeked around the corner, her small face tight with worry. I knelt beside her and said that everything was fine. She did not look convinced. At night, I lay awake listening to Grant typing on his laptop, sending messages that he shielded from view. I knew he was building a case, gathering fragments to portray me as fragile and incapable. Yet there was a quiet strength forming inside me, subtle and steady. The next morning, I packed Lena's backpack and tucked a slice of homemade bread inside. Grant glanced at the wooden spoon resting on the counter and scoffed, saying that sentimental objects were pointless. I touched the spoon slowly, feeling its familiar warmth. I thought about Evelyn's words and about the way support disappears when it is no longer convenient. I stood there, in the same kitchen where my life once felt rooted, and I realized that isolation could either break me or reveal what remained unshakable. The budgeting app pinged with another notification, reminding me of restrictions and approvals. But I simply turned off the sound and continued preparing breakfast, aware that a shift was beginning within me, quiet but real. After the tightening grip of financial control and the quiet affirmation I received from Evelyn on her porch, I knew I needed help. Yet I hesitated because asking for help felt like admitting defeat. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of unopened mail, I found a card from a law office bearing the name Lucas Reed. The name stirred something familiar in my memory, and I recalled a man with kind eyes who used to visit the restaurant where I worked as a head chef years ago. He often brought his wife and 2 young children, and they sat near the window where the morning light spilled across the table like a soft curtain. I remembered the night when his card declined at the register, and his face flushed with embarrassment. He whispered that he was between jobs and that he would return tomorrow to settle the bill. I saw the fear behind his smile, and without hesitation, I paid for the meal myself. I told him the kitchen had decided to treat them, and his eyes shimmered with relief. I never mentioned it again, not to him, not to Grant, not to anyone. It was a small act, tucked quietly into the folds of my life, like the handwritten notes I used to slip into Grant's lunchbox. Now, years later, I sat at my kitchen table holding Lucas's business card. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that someone who once witnessed me at my strongest might now see me at my weakest. I called his office, and his assistant scheduled a consultation the next day. When I arrived, Lucas stood to greet me with recognition lighting his face. He said he remembered the warmth of my food and the way the restaurant felt like a refuge. I felt my throat tighten at the thought that someone still saw value in a part of me that Grant had tried to erase. As I explained the situation, Lucas listened with a stillness that conveyed respect rather than judgment. I told him about the drained accounts, the custody demand, and the portrayal of me as unstable. He asked about my daily routine, and when I described waking before dawn to cook, pack lunches, and manage the home, he nodded slowly as though assembling pieces of a puzzle others refused to see. He asked how long I had been out of the professional kitchen, and I admitted that I left the career I loved so Grant could pursue his ambitions. For a moment, his eyes softened with something like sorrow, and he leaned forward as if to acknowledge the enormity of that sacrifice without diminishing it with praise. During our conversation, Lena's laughter drifted through my memory, and I thought of the wooden spoon resting on my kitchen counter. Lucas asked if I had legal representation, and I shook my head. He leaned back in his chair and said that he would take my case with minimal fees. I asked why, and he reminded me of the night I paid for his family's dinner. He said that at the time he was unemployed, studying for the bar exam, and terrified he would not be able to provide for his family. He said that my act of generosity carried him through that night and that he promised himself he would repay it someday. I stared at him, stunned. I had never expected anything in return and had long forgotten the moment. Lucas said he was not offering help out of pity, but out of repayment for a kindness that I never used to elevate myself. His words struck something deep within me. I realized that while Grant dismissed my contributions, someone who barely knew me had carried the memory of my generosity for years. He said that people like me often underestimate the power of the support they give, and that I had provided nourishment far beyond food. I inhaled slowly, feeling a shift inside, subtle but real. He explained that my sacrifices would matter in court, and that the years I dedicated to building a home demonstrated stability rather than weakness. Hearing those words reframed my life in a way I had never allowed myself to imagine. Leaving his office, I felt lighter, though the situation remained heavy. The air outside carried a crisp breeze, and I clutched the wooden spoon I had unconsciously brought with me in my bag. I thought about how the spoon had stirred soup for tired workers, comforted my daughter, and held the imprint of my mother's hand. I realized that my value was not tied to a paycheck, but to the countless unseen ways I built a life for my family. As I drove home, I recalled Lucas's words about dignity and repayment, and I felt something return to me that I thought I had lost. It was not confidence, not yet, but the faint outline of self-worth beginning to take shape again. After meeting with Lucas and leaving his office with a renewed sense of direction, I returned home determined to stay steady, yet the atmosphere inside the house had shifted further against me and the signs appeared in subtle yet devastating ways. One afternoon, I found printed photographs on Grant's desk, showing me sitting on the edge of our bed with tears on my cheeks. I remembered that moment clearly. I had been overwhelmed by the strain of losing financial access, and I thought I was alone. Seeing the image reduced to evidence made my stomach tighten. Grant walked into the room and said the photos demonstrated mood instability. His tone was clinical, detached, and he spoke as though he were documenting a case study rather than discussing the woman he once loved. I felt the familiar metallic emptiness spread through my ribs, but I remained calm. The wooden spoon rested in my hand, and I gripped it to steady myself. A few days later, a packet of receipts arrived in the mail from the shared account, highlighting purchases for expensive handbags and restaurant dinners. I stared at them, recognizing none of the transactions. Grant appeared in the doorway and said that the statements proved reckless spending and financial irresponsibility. I told him I had never bought those things, and he shrugged, suggesting that stress might be affecting my memory. His tone was patronizing, deliberate, and calculated to make me doubt my own sense of reality. I felt heat rise in my face, but I kept my voice level, knowing that any emotional reaction would be used to reinforce his narrative. The house seemed colder, even with the oven warming the kitchen. One evening, while Lena was coloring at the table, I overheard Grant speaking on the phone. His voice was low but firm, and he referenced an evaluation from Dr. Marin Hale. The name struck me with sharp recognition. I had seen her texting Grant late at night months earlier, her messages labeled as professional consultations. Hearing her name connected to a psychological report about me made my stomach twist. I realized she was not only a therapist, but his mistress, and together they were constructing a portrayal of me as unstable. The betrayal felt like a blade pressed against my skin, yet I remained silent. I folded laundry with steady hands while his voice drifted through the hallway, shaping lies into legal ammunition. Soon, I noticed changes in Lena's behavior. She became quieter, watching me with cautious eyes as though evaluating me through someone else's description. When Grant picked her up from school, he whispered that I cried and yelled while she was gone. He told her that she needed to be brave and stay strong when she was with me. I watched confusion flicker across her face, and my heart ached with a pain deeper than anything I had known. At bedtime, she asked if I was sad because I had done something wrong. I pulled her close and told her that feelings did not make someone weak. She rested her head on my shoulder, but I could feel her hesitancy, like a door half open. The next morning, I baked banana bread for her breakfast. Hoping the familiar smell would bring comfort, she sat at the table holding the wooden spoon in her small hands while she waited for the first slice. The sight pierced me. The spoon had become her tether to the parts of me she still trusted. She ate slowly with her eyes lowered as, though afraid to appear too attached to me. I watched her and felt a moral conflict carve itself into my chest. I wondered if I could blame her if she chose Grant, if she believed what he told her, if she drifted away because she was a child trying to make sense of the world presented to her. The question echoed inside me like a quiet bell, and the ache of it expanded through my body. Grant continued compiling manufactured evidence, and I documented each moment, storing digital copies, saving timestamps, and keeping notes in a small notebook hidden inside a cookbook. I knew that reacting would only serve his agenda. I spoke gently to Lena, offering steadiness even when my heart felt fractured. Each time she clutched the wooden spoon while eating the baked goods I made, I felt a fragile thread holding us together, delicate yet unbroken. In the stillness of those moments, I reminded myself that truth does not need to shout to exist. I stood in the kitchen, the scent of warm bread lingering in the air, and I understood that strength could live inside silence. Winter arrived quietly, and the cold settled into the house the same way the distance settled between Grant and me after he gathered his evidence. One afternoon, he carried his belongings down the hall and moved into the guest room without explanation. The sound of drawers opening and closing echoed through the hallway like a quiet announcement. I stood in the kitchen stirring soup with the wooden spoon, listening to the shift in our home as though listening to ice forming on a lake. When Lena asked why her father was sleeping in another room, he told her that adults sometimes needed space and that she should not worry. I watched her absorb the change with wide eyes, and I offered her a warm bowl, hoping the taste would anchor her to something safe. Grant began bringing home expensive gifts for Lena, wrapping them in glossy paper and presenting them with dramatic flair. He bought her a designer coat, a tablet far beyond what she needed, and a necklace with a gemstone that sparkled under the kitchen lights. Lena looked from him to me, confused, as though trying to understand which world she belonged to. I thanked him politely, even though the gifts were meant to draw lines of allegiance. I continued cooking, folding laundry, and tending to the home with quiet consistency. My silence was not surrender, it was a shield. One Saturday morning, I woke to find the house unusually quiet. Lena's bedroom was empty, her backpack missing, and her boots gone from the doorway. I checked the driveway and saw that Grant's car was not there. He had taken her without saying a word. My heart tightened, but I refused to panic. I sat at the kitchen table with the wooden spoon resting across my palms and breathed slowly. Hours passed before they returned, and when the door opened, Lena was carrying bags of new clothes and holding a cup of hot chocolate. Grant announced that she needed a change of scenery and that he had taken her to an amusement park. He said I should relax more and enjoy my free time. His tone was taunting, but I remained calm. I told Lena I was glad she had fun, and I meant it with quiet sincerity. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. He took her to dinners without warning and to weekend outings without discussion. I stayed steady, preparing meals and waiting with gentle assurance rather than confrontation. The tension rose like a slow tide. Grant tried to provoke me with comments about how children gravitate toward stability and excitement. I stirred batter, wiped counters, and refused to give him what he wanted. My silence frustrated him. His eyes narrowed when I remained composed. He wanted tears, anger, or outbursts that he could twist into evidence. One evening, he approached me while I folded linens in the living room. He stood close, arms crossed, and told me that most women in my position would be falling apart. He said that if I cried or yelled, he could record it and show the court how unstable I was. His voice carried a cruel satisfaction, as though he believed he had already won. I looked at him steadily, the wooden spoon still tucked into my apron pocket, and I felt something shift inside me. The metallic emptiness that once filled my chest was replaced with a quiet clarity. My voice came out calm and even as I told him that I no longer cried because of him. The words hung in the air, steady and unshakable. For the first time, he looked unsettled. His confidence faltered, if only for a second, and he turned away without another word. I realized then that silence could be more powerful than anger, and that composure could be a form of resistance. From that moment forward, I carried myself with deliberate calm. I tucked Lena into bed each night, reading to her in a soothing voice while she clutched the wooden spoon like a talisman. She asked if I was sad, and I told her that even when life felt cold, warmth could return. She rested her head against my shoulder, and I felt the fragile thread between us strengthen. The winter deepened, and the house felt like a frozen landscape with separate territories. Grant continued trying to provoke reactions, but I stayed steady. I baked bread, simmered soups, and performed the rituals of care that once formed the foundation of our home. Each act reminded me of who I was before his narrative tried to reshape me. My silence was no longer emptiness. It was strength. I understood that while he wanted to break me to justify his choices, I had the power to remain whole. One night, as snow fell outside and the house settled into stillness, I sat at the kitchen table with the wooden spoon resting beside a cup of tea. I watched the flakes drift past the window and realized that winter does not last forever. Even the coldest season gives way to thaw. I sensed that a turning point was approaching, slow but inevitable, and I knew that when the moment came, I would be ready. The mediation session was scheduled for late morning, and I arrived with Lucas at my side while holding the wooden spoon inside my bag like a hidden anchor. The conference room was bright with polished tables and framed certificates on the walls, yet the atmosphere felt heavy. Grant was already seated, leaning back in his chair with a relaxed confidence that suggested he believed the outcome was predetermined. His attorney organized a stack of papers while offering a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. I sat across from them and folded my hands in my lap, feeling the familiar calm I had cultivated through the quiet winter. The mediator entered and spoke in a neutral tone, outlining the purpose of the meeting, emphasizing cooperation and fairness. I listened, breathing slowly, aware of the way Grant watched me, searching for signs of weakness. When the first proposal slid across the table, I scanned the page and felt an internal stillness tighten. The document stated that I would leave the house within 30 days, waive any claim to marital assets, and be allowed to visit Lena only twice per month. I lifted my eyes, meeting Grant's confident gaze. He said this was reasonable, and that since he was the primary earner, the law would support him. His voice carried an air of superiority, as though the home I built and maintained for years was merely a backdrop to his achievements. The mediator asked if I had questions, and I shook my head while Lucas requested time to review the language. My silence was not agreement, it was restraint. As Lucas turned the pages, his jaw tightened. He asked Grant's attorney how they justified denying shared assets after a long marriage in which I provided full domestic support. The attorney replied that homemaking did not constitute legal labor for property division, and Grant nodded in agreement. He repeated the claim more bluntly, saying that cooking and cleaning were not contributions, and that in America, only those who earn money have rights. His words struck with sharp cruelty. I felt the metallic hollowness stir inside me, yet I remained composed, breathing evenly. The mediator shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us. Lucas slammed his pen down with controlled force and declared that the statement was insulting, outdated, and legally questionable. His voice carried the heat I did not release. He said that he had seen families fall apart and that the unseen work of homemakers was often the only structure keeping lives together. Grant leaned back, smirking, and asked why I needed a lawyer when I never worked. His tone was deliberate, intended to provoke. I met his eyes without flinching. I did not give him the reaction he sought. My silence felt like stone, grounded and immovable. I could feel the wooden spoon through the fabric of my bag, its worn shape pressing against my palm. The mediator attempted to calm the room and suggested we take a moment to breathe. Lucas muttered that he was breathing just fine, and I felt a subtle warmth in my chest at his conviction. The attorney continued outlining the agreement, emphasizing that I would have no financial claim and minimal parental involvement. My heart tightened at the thought of seeing Lena only twice each month, yet I maintained composure, knowing that emotion would be used against me. I imagined her sitting at the table holding the spoon while eating banana bread, the uncertain look in her eyes, and the fragile thread that still connected us. I could not allow that thread to be severed. As the negotiations continued, the tension rose like a wave. Grant tapped his pen on the table, watching me as though waiting for the moment I would break. He mentioned that Lena needed stability and fun, implying that I offered neither. He said children preferred parents who could provide excitement and luxury. I remained steady, knowing that his words said more about him than me. The mediator asked if I had anything to say, and I shook my head calmly, allowing Lucas to speak for me. My silence was intentional, a strategic refusal to validate their narrative. In the stillness of that room, a realization settled through me. I thought about all the years I chose silence to maintain peace, believing that avoiding conflict was an act of love. I thought about every meal, every morning, every moment I poured myself into the foundation of our home. I understood then that silence had become the very thing that allowed the distance to grow unchecked. The recognition did not come with bitterness, but with clarity. I heard my own thoughts speak to me with quiet honesty. I once chose silence to preserve my family, yet silence had nurtured the divide that now stood between us like a wall. The mediator eventually paused the meeting, acknowledging that no agreement could be reached under such imbalance. Grant looked annoyed, tapping his foot, yet I felt calm. I stood slowly, smoothing my coat, and the wooden spoon shifted inside my bag with reassuring weight. Lucas placed a hand on my shoulder and told me we would prepare for court with stronger evidence. I nodded, feeling a steady pulse of strength where fear used to live. Grant called after me, suggesting that I reconsider before things became humiliating. I turned slightly, met his gaze, and spoke with a voice steady as winter air. I told him that humiliation requires shame, and I no longer carried any. Leaving the building, I felt the cold wind brush my face, and I breathed deeply. The moral conflict that once tangled inside me now felt clear. I could not blame Lena for being influenced, and I could not blame myself for the years I stayed quiet. What mattered now was the path ahead. I walked toward the parking lot with Lucas beside me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the ground beneath me hold firm. The first court hearing arrived sooner than I felt ready for, despite the preparation Lucas and I had done after the failed mediation. I walked into the courtroom holding the wooden spoon inside my bag, its familiar weight calming my breath. The air felt thick with anticipation, and the murmur of voices echoed off the polished walls. Grant sat across the aisle with an air of confidence, his suit perfectly pressed, his posture relaxed. His attorney arranged folders and evidence displays with smug efficiency. I sat beside Lucas, folding my hands tightly to keep them steady. When the judge entered, everyone rose. His expression was neutral, yet his eyes flicked briefly toward Grant, and I sensed a subtle tilt in the room before the proceedings even began. The clerk called the case, and Grant's attorney wasted no time presenting the first set of evidence. The screen lit up with photographs of me sitting on the edge of the bed, tears streaking down my face. I recognized the moments instantly. They were private, intimate fragments of vulnerability captured without my knowledge. The attorney narrated them as indicators of instability. My chest tightened and my pulse quickened. I tried to stay composed, but the sight of my own grief displayed like an exhibit made heat rise behind my eyes. I swallowed hard, gripping my knees to anchor myself. Then came the receipts, projected in bold clarity. Designer handbags, expensive dinners, luxury goods I had never touched. The attorney suggested that I had spent irresponsibly and recklessly depleted marital funds. I opened my mouth to protest, but Lucas placed a steadying hand on my arm, signaling me to wait. I bit the inside of my cheek and remained silent, though anger pulsed beneath my ribs. The judge nodded slowly as though absorbing the narrative. My heart thudded, and the metallic emptiness pressed through me again. The most painful moment came when a video clip played. It showed me wiping tears in the kitchen, unaware that a camera had been positioned behind a row of cookbooks. Grant's voiceover recording described emotional volatility. I felt a tremor in my hands, and before I could stop myself, I whispered that it was taken without my consent. The judge lifted a brow and reminded me to speak only when addressed. My voice fell silent, and shame pricked my skin. I inhaled, trying to regain composure, but the damage was done. My reaction fed their portrayal. Then the bailiff called the next witness, and Dr. Marin Hale stepped forward. She wore a tailored blazer and carried herself with polished confidence. She introduced herself as a clinical psychologist and claimed to have evaluated my emotional condition indirectly through reports provided by Grant. Her tone was cool and authoritative, and the judge leaned in slightly as she spoke. She testified that based on documented behavior patterns, I exhibited signs of instability that could affect parental reliability. She never mentioned her relationship with Grant, and I watched the court absorb her words as though they were objective truth. Lucas stood to cross-examine, asking whether she had ever met me, spoken to me, or conducted a direct evaluation. She admitted she had not. He asked whether relying on personal reports from one spouse compromised clinical neutrality. She deflected with professional phrasing, stating that behavioral indicators were sufficient for concern. I clenched my jaw, feeling the imbalance stretch like a widening gulf. The judge appeared persuaded by her credentials. I felt a flicker of helplessness seep into my chest. Grant then testified, speaking in gentle tones about Lena's need for stability. He said that I cried frequently, yelled without reason, and created tense environments. He He spoke with an air of concern, playing the role of the calm, rational parent. The judge nodded along, taking notes. I wanted to stand and shout the truth, to reveal his manipulation, his calculated provocations, his cruel theatrics. Yet I stayed seated, gripping the wooden spoon inside my bag until my fingers ached. My breathing grew uneven, and Lucas shot me a warning look. I tried to steady myself, but the accumulation of distortions pressed too heavily. When the judge asked if I wished to respond, I began speaking, but my voice quivered. I said that the photographs were moments of private exhaustion, not instability. I said the purchases were not mine. My words came too fast, fueled by rising emotion. I saw Grant's faint smile, satisfied. The judge raised a hand, telling me to slow down, noting that my tone sounded reactive. A flush burned across my cheeks. I felt as though the room was tilting. I tried to regain composure, but the tremor in my voice betrayed me. I fell silent, swallowing the rising heat. The imbalance became undeniable. The judge announced that based on the preliminary evidence, temporary custody would remain with Grant, and that visitation would be supervised until further review. The words landed like stones in my chest. I stared ahead, unable to breathe for a moment. Lena looked toward me with confusion and fear, and my heart fractured silently. I wanted to run to her, hold her, reassure her, but protocol held me frozen. When the hearing ended, I stood on unsteady legs. Grant walked past me, whispering that things would be easier if I stopped resisting. Marin walked beside him, her expression unreadable. Lucas told me that this was only the first battle and that the truth would surface in time. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. We stepped outside into the cold air, and I inhaled deeply, feeling the ache settle into my bones. The wooden spoon pressed against my side like a reminder that the foundation of who I was had not disappeared, even if the court could not yet see it. The night before the final ruling, the house felt as though it were holding its breath. The temporary orders from the first hearing lingered like a faint echo in every room. And yet there was a strange stillness inside me, the kind that arrives when fear finally exhausts itself. Grant had taken Lena to stay with him at his condo for most of the week, but that evening she was allowed to sleep at the house. The judge wanted her to be in a familiar environment before appearing in court. I spent the late afternoon cleaning the kitchen in small, deliberate motions, wiping counters that were already spotless and straightening chairs that did not need adjusting. The wooden spoon lay on the counter where the soft glow of the stovetop lamp touched its worn handle. I picked it up and ran my thumb along the groove worn by years of stirring sauce, batter, and soup. It felt like the backbone of my life, steady and familiar, even when everything else had shifted into something unrecognizable. As I stood there, a memory rose so clearly that it felt like stepping through a doorway. I could almost hear the soft squeak of the old apartment cabinets and smell the sweetness of batter browning in a hot pan. Lena had been 3 years old, her hair in messy pigtails and her feet barely touching the rung of the chair where she sat. It was a Sunday morning when I decided to make waffles in the cramped kitchen of our first home. Grant had still been the man who rushed to help, who kissed my cheek just because he could. I had held the wooden spoon in one hand and the mixing bowl in the other, and Lena had watched with wide, fascinated eyes as I whisked the batter until it turned smooth and pale. She reached for the spoon, her tiny fingers curling clumsily around the handle, and I guided her hand as she stirred. She giggled at the way the batter swirled, and I laughed with her, feeling like the entire world existed inside that warm, sunlit room. When the first waffle came off the iron, steam rising like a quiet whisper, Lena clapped her hands. I cut it into small squares and placed them on her plate with a few berries on top. She took a bite, then looked up at me with pure delight and said it tasted like home. The words struck me then, simple and perfect. I had grown up in a house where meals were hurried and affection lived between the lines. Hearing my daughter call something I made home felt like a blessing placed gently in my hands. Grant walked in at that moment, hair tousled and eyes warm with gratitude. He wrapped his arms around me from behind and thanked me for making the morning special. I believed then that we were building something solid, something no storm could undo. Now, years later, I stood in a larger kitchen with nicer appliances and colder air. The wooden spoon was the same, though. It had followed us through every rental and every purchase, surviving renovations and reinventions. It was the one constant in a life rearranged by someone else's ambition. I turned it over slowly, feeling the ghost of that Sunday morning. I realized that while Grant had drifted far from the man he once was, the promise I made to myself when Lena was small had never shifted. I vowed she would always know she had a place where she was loved without conditions. That night she slept in her old room, though it no longer felt fully hers. The walls still held framed drawings she had made, but half her clothes now lived at Grant's condo, and new toys, she mentioned, belonged to spaces I could not see. She lay curled on her side, holding her old tablet against her chest like a stuffed animal. Its screen was dark and its edges worn from years of use. I once used it to show her cooking videos and picture books. Now I no longer knew what she watched or who helped her choose. I sat on the edge of her bed and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. In sleep, she still looked impossibly young. I listened to the quiet rhythm of her breathing and felt the weight of the coming day settle over me. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, people who barely knew us would decide how much of her life I would be allowed to witness. They would measure reports and receipts, images and opinions, while the years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, and homemade waffles remained invisible. I thought of how she hesitated now before hugging me when Grant was near, how confusion had dimmed her once effortless affection. I knew he had filled her ears with stories about my sadness, my tears, my supposed instability. I also knew she was a child navigating loyalties she should never have been asked to choose between. Leaning closer, I whispered her name. She shifted softly but did not wake. The words gathered heavy in my chest. I told her that tomorrow, if she chose her father, I would still love her. I told her that if fear or pressure or confusion led her to say things that hurt me, my heart would bruise but would not close. My voice remained steady, yet inside, a deep conflict pulled at me. Every part of me wanted her to stand beside me, to tell the court she felt safe with me, to see through the manipulation. Yet another part, shaped by every tender night and every scraped knee, knew that my love could not depend on victory. As I spoke, I felt the slow pivot taking shape within me. I realized that tomorrow was not only about custody, it was about who I would be when the storm passed. I could become hardened and bitter, or I could remain the woman who once paid for a stranger's dinner and taught her child that waffles could taste like home. The law might not value the labor of my hands, but memory would. I could not control what she would say or how the judge might interpret it, but I could choose the kind of mother she would remember when she grew older. I placed the wooden spoon gently on her nightstand, its handle pointing toward her hand. It felt like setting down a piece of our story where she could reach it if she wanted. I kissed her forehead and let the quiet wrap around us. Fear was still there, but it was no longer the only thing inside me. There was also calm resolve, born from knowing that love does not vanish because a judge signs a paper. When I left her room and turned out the light, I carried that resolve with me down the hallway. Tomorrow, whatever happened, I would walk into that courtroom as the woman I had always been. Not a victim, not a perfect hero, but a mother who built a home the only way she knew how. One meal, one story, one steady act of kindness at a time. The morning of the final hearing arrived with a gray sky and a stillness that felt almost deliberate. I dressed quietly, choosing simple clothes and tying my hair back while the house remained silent. I slipped the wooden spoon into my bag, letting its familiar weight rest against my palm as I walked to the car. Lucas drove, and though he spoke about strategy, I listened more to the rhythm of my breathing. I felt calm in a way that surprised even me. It was not the calm of denial, but the calm that comes when a person has already faced the worst possibilities and remained standing. When we reached the courthouse, reporters waited on the steps, attracted by the involvement of a well-known real estate figure and a respected psychologist. Their presence felt distant, like voices underwater. We walked past them without pausing, and inside the building, the air held the scent of polished wood and cool stone. I sat at the plaintiff's table, folding my hands neatly as the clerk called for quiet. Grant entered with a confident stride, wearing a suit that looked custom-tailored and a smile that carried certainty. His attorney shook his hand and whispered something that made him nod. He glanced at me briefly, expecting to see fear, but my stillness unsettled him. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Lena sat near the front, accompanied by a court-appointed advocate. She looked small in the large room, her feet not touching the floor, her tablet resting in her lap. I wanted to reach for her, but I stayed composed. The judge entered and the room rose, then settled again in a hush. He spoke about the purpose of the hearing, the evidence reviewed, and the responsibility of determining a custody arrangement that would best serve the child. His voice was steady, yet I sensed his inclination leaning toward Grant. It was visible in the way he referenced financial stability and professional assessments. Lucas presented our closing remarks, articulating the value of unseen labor and the manipulation that had shaped the case against me, yet the judge's expression remained unreadable. Grant then stood and addressed the court in a tone crafted to sound humble and concerned. He spoke about Lena needing structure and about my supposed emotional unpredictability. He described himself as patient and dedicated, using phrases designed to reassure. His attorney followed, emphasizing financial capability and professional endorsements. The imbalance in the room felt stark, yet I remained steady. I did not look away from the judge. I did not clasp my hands too tightly. I did not let my breath quicken. The calm inside me held firm, like a quiet center beneath a storm. When the judge prepared to read his ruling, he adjusted his glasses and lifted the document. Grant leaned back slightly, confident in the decision he believed was coming. His posture radiated triumph. I sat perfectly still, feeling neither defeated nor desperate. I glanced at Lena, who was staring down at her tablet with a look of troubled concentration. The room settled into complete silence. The judge began to speak, outlining considerations of financial reliability, psychological evaluation, and household stability. Each word felt like a stone being placed on a scale that was already tipped. Lucas inhaled slowly, preparing himself. Grant straightened in anticipation. I remained composed because something inside me sensed that the story was not yet finished. The judge reached the point in his statement where he would declare custody, and the tension in the room tightened. Then, before he could continue, a small voice rose from the front row. It was clear, steady, and unexpectedly brave. Lena stood, her hands holding the tablet against her chest. She looked at the judge and asked if she could show something that her mother did not know about. Her voice carried through the courtroom with surprising strength, and every head turned. The judge paused, startled, and the bailiff took a step forward. Grant's expression cracked, surprise flashing across his face. His attorney whispered urgently, but Lena did not sit down. She repeated her request, addressing the judge respectfully. The room held its breath. The judge hesitated, then nodded slowly, allowing her to approach. My heart pounded, yet I did not move. I did not speak. I did not reach for her. I watched her walk forward with small but determined steps, the tablet held like evidence she had chosen on her own. The judge asked what she wished to show. She lifted the tablet and prepared to connect it to the courtroom monitor. In that moment, with every eye upon her, I felt the calm inside me deepen. I understood that whatever happened next would not be controlled by Grant, nor by attorneys, nor by fabricated reports. Something had shifted, and the balance in the room tilted in a way no one expected. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting gently in my lap, and waited for the truth to speak in the voice of a child who had seen more than anyone realized. When Lena connected her tablet to the courtroom monitor, the screen flickered once, then filled with an image that made the air in the room turn to glass. Grant stepped forward as if to stop it, but the judge raised a hand, signaling him to remain still. I sat frozen in my chair, my palms resting lightly against my knees, the wooden spoon pressing against my side inside my bag like a heartbeat. The video opened with the unmistakable interior of Grant's condo, the one he claimed was only used for business meetings. The camera angle suggested it had been recorded from a phone set on a counter. Marin entered the frame first, her hair loose around her shoulders, laughing softly as she poured 2 glasses of wine. A moment later, Grant appeared, slipping his arm around her waist and kissing her with an intimacy that stripped away any professional illusion. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. My breath caught, yet I remained composed, watching without blinking. Then the conversation began. Their voices were clear, casual, and cruel. Marin asked if everything was in place, and Grant nodded, saying that he had already transferred the funds from the joint account into a private portfolio under his name. He said that once the divorce was finalized, I would have no access to anything. Marin smiled and called it strategic. Grant laughed, saying that in America, money determines truth. He lifted his glass and toasted to winning. The judge leaned forward, his expression sharp. Grant's attorney shifted uncomfortably. My heart thudded once, hard, then steadied. I watched without flinching. The next segment of the video shifted slightly, as if the phone had been moved closer. Marin asked about the custody arrangement, and Grant replied that he would get full custody because I would appear unstable. She asked if he was sure. He grinned and said that he had already set the stage. He referenced the hidden camera in the kitchen and the photos taken without my knowledge. He described how he provoked me intentionally, telling me painful things to make me cry. He said that once the court saw emotional vulnerability, they would assume weakness. His tone was confident, rehearsed, practiced. Marin praised him, calling it brilliant. A gasp broke across the room like a sudden wind. The judge's eyebrows lifted, and he exchanged a look with the clerk. The next words struck like a blade. Marin asked if there was any risk that I might hold myself together. Grant shook his head and said that a woman like me was easy to break. He said all it took was one push, one accusation, one moment alone in a room to unravel years of confidence. Then he said the sentence that cut through the courtroom like a crack of thunder. He said that all he had to do was push lightly and I would collapse on my own. The words echoed on the speakers, and the silence that followed was absolute. My pulse slowed instead of racing. I felt the wooden spoon against my ribs, grounding me. I did not look at Grant. I did not look at anyone. I kept my gaze forward and breathed. The final part of the video showed Grant and Marin discussing how they would present themselves as responsible protectors while depicting me as fragile. They spoke of legal timing, media sympathy, and financial advantage. Marin said that once the ruling was done, they could travel freely without concern. Grant replied that by then, I would be too defeated to fight. His confidence dripped like oil, heavy and slick. The video ended with the sound of their laughter. Then the screen went black. The courtroom remained frozen. No one moved. No one whispered. No one even shifted in their seat. The judge stared at the blank screen for a long moment, then looked at Grant with an expression that stripped the room of warmth. He asked Grant if he wished to explain. Grant opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His face was drained of color. The attorney beside him fumbled through papers, stammering that the video might be edited, but his voice lacked conviction. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. In a voice that carried authority like a struck bell, the judge announced that the proceedings would be suspended for immediate investigation on the grounds of coercion, evidence tampering, financial concealment, and possible criminal misconduct. He ordered the bailiff to detain both Grant and Marin for questioning. The room erupted into stunned motion. The bailiff approached them, placing a hand on Grant's shoulder. Marin stepped back, her face pale, her confidence dissolved. Grant turned toward me then, his eyes wide with disbelief, searching for something. Anger, triumph, reaction. I offered him none. I remained seated, silent, still. The judge asked if I required a recess, and I answered calmly that I was fine. My voice did not shake. My hands did not tremble. I did not gloat or smile or look away. The power that once slipped through my fingers now settled into my spine like a quiet pillar. Reporters outside could be heard shouting through the glass doors, sensing a story shifting shape. Lena sat in her seat, watching everything with wide eyes, clutching her tablet to her chest. She looked at me with a mixture of relief and awe, and I nodded once, reassuring her. Lucas exhaled slowly and whispered that silence had been my greatest strength. I felt tears prick behind my eyes, but they did not fall. There was no collapse, no shaking, no visible relief. There was only calm. The judge announced that custody would revert to neutral status until the investigation concluded and that I would have unrestricted access to Lena in the interim. His words felt like a door opening, yet I remained composed. I stood when instructed, gathered my bag, and walked out of the courtroom with steady steps. Outside, microphones thrust toward me, asking how it felt to be vindicated. I did not answer. My silence spoke more clearly than any sentence could. I reached for Lena's hand, and she slipped her fingers into mine without hesitation. The wooden spoon rested in my bag, warm against my side, a reminder that foundations built with love can withstand the weight of storms. I walked down the courthouse steps with my daughter beside me, not triumphant, not boastful, simply whole. My silence had not been defeated. It had been endurance. And now, without a single shouted word, it had become victory. 3 months have passed since the day the courtroom fell silent and the truth reshaped the path ahead of me. Life did not snap back into place all at once, but unfolded slowly, like dough rising in a warm kitchen. Lena and I now live in a small apartment near the coast where the windows open to the sound of waves and the scent of salt drifting through the air. The space is modest, but sunlight spills across the floor each morning, and there is a quiet peace here that the old house never held in its final years. I placed the wooden spoon on the kitchen counter the first night we arrived, letting it claim its place before anything else. It looked almost luminous against the pale surface, and I realized that home was not the walls around us, but the life we shaped within them. Each morning I wake before the sun, not out of obligation but out of choice. I whisk batter, slice fruit, and prepare breakfast while the ocean breeze lifts the curtains. Lena walks into the kitchen with sleep still in her eyes, and she sits at the table holding the spoon the way she did when she was younger. She tells me about her dreams and her school projects, and I listen while the waffles brown in the pan. There's no tension, no fear, no careful measuring of words. She eats slowly, savoring each bite, and the warmth between us feels restored. When she leaves for school, she hugs me without hesitation, and I hold her for a moment longer than necessary, grateful for the return of something I once feared lost. My home cooking service has grown faster than I expected. What began with a few neighbors asking for meals has become a small business built on word of mouth. People say my food feels like comfort, like memory, like a story being told without words. I deliver meals to elderly couples, new parents, and tired workers, and each container carries the flavors of a life rebuilt. I spend afternoons planning menus and evenings preparing orders, and for the first time in years, I feel my talent breathing again. The wooden spoon stirs sauces with the same steadiness it always had, anchoring me to the knowledge that my worth never depended on someone else recognizing it. One afternoon, Lucas stopped by the apartment with fresh herbs from his garden. He placed them on the counter and asked if I had ever considered opening a community kitchen. He said I had a gift, not just for cooking, but for creating belonging, and that there were people in town who needed both nourishment and a place to gather. He offered to partner with me, handling the legal and structural side while I shaped the spirit of the space. His offer carried no pressure, only possibility. I told him I would think about it, and he smiled, saying that the best things in life often rise slowly. When he left, I stood at the sink washing the spoon and wondered what it might feel like to build something new entirely on my own terms. Evelyn visits often, walking up the sandy path with a basket of lemons from her backyard tree. She sits at the small kitchen table sipping tea while watching the waves through the open balcony door. She tells stories of her years as a teacher, of the students who returned years later to thank her, and of the life she rebuilt after losing her husband. Her presence feels steady like a lighthouse that has weathered many storms. One afternoon she looked at me, her eyes soft with understanding, and said that women like us are remembered only when needed. The words echoed through me, familiar yet transformed. I smiled and told her that I was still silent, but the difference now was that I was walking forward rather than standing still. She nodded, and the sunlight caught the spoon on the table, making it shine. Grant and Marin remain under investigation, and though people occasionally whisper updates, I do not follow the details closely. My life no longer revolves around their choices or their consequences. Some might say forgiveness should come next, but forgiveness is not a door I must rush through. Some wounds need time to air before they close. I do not hate them. Hatred would tie me to them with ropes I no longer wish to hold. Instead, I let the tide of distance carry them farther away from my thoughts each day. Lena asks fewer questions now, though sometimes she pauses, searching my face with a seriousness beyond her years. One night she asked if I was angry with her for believing her father. I pulled her close and told her that love is not something children should earn. She rested her head against my shoulder, and I felt the quiet healing settle between us. The moral conflict that once twisted inside me has softened into understanding. She is a child who navigated confusion the only way she knew how, and I am a mother who never stopped loving her through it. Sometimes I walk along the shoreline at dusk, listening to the waves fold over themselves, steady and unhurried. I think about the courtroom, the stillness inside me, and the way silence became strength rather than surrender. I think about how life cracked open, not with violence, but with truth. I think about the generations of women who carried families on their shoulders while the world pretended not to see. The wooden spoon rests on the table when I return, glowing in the late afternoon light like a quiet testament to all that endured. As I sit here now, with the ocean outside my window and the aroma of fresh bread in the air, I realize that healing does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in the form of breakfast, shared without tension, businesses built from kindness, friendships formed in resilience, and daughters who return to the warmth of home. I no longer need to raise my voice to prove anything. My life speaks for itself. If you were in my place, would you forgive me? I wonder how you would carry the weight of betrayal, the quiet strength of endurance, and the slow rebuilding of a life. I would love to hear your story, your thoughts, and your heart. Tell me what you would have done, and let us share the space where healing begins.